So third class on the discarded image. I said last class we'd get to the heavens, which we then did not. That was my, what do we call that? A reach goal or some stupid thing. That's what a politician said once about her aim to do something that was impossible. And then failure was it was only a reach goal, as in, I don't know. Anyway, people say the funniest things. But I left off last time saying that we'd get to the heavens. We didn't get to the heavens, and now we're going to get to the heavens. And that is, I think, about page 98. Oh, good job. Is that correct? The heavens are, I don't have the page, 92. According to this. There we go. Wherein we deal with the parts of the universe. So we talked about the discarded image, and I've suggested that in that image, what we're having is a whole cosmology. And one of the things that one notices in contemporary thought is that there are very few discussions of cosmology, even though even in Christian circles we speak of worldview. The word worldview, even taken as a one word thing, taken from the German Weltanschauung, which is actually two words composite, is taken to be the sort of big picture of our views. But in the circles in which that phrase is used, worldview, tends to be Dutch neo-Calvinist thought. And they think about things and the implications of it under the influence of the idea that everything that God has created is implicated to his creative impulse and his redemptive impulse and so forth. So everything is included under the realm of Christian knowledge, and therefore we ought to have not just belief in God, but a whole worldview with that. People use that language. You've heard the language used at any rate. What I find interesting in that is that we're very serious about worldview, especially if you come from that Dutch neo-Calvinist stable of thought, which I do more or less, because that tends to be the Reformed tradition from which I come, and the thinkers in that tradition, at least contemporary, have largely come from the Dutch neo-Calvinist stable, so they speak of worldview, language, books on it. I note two things. The phrase worldview is a translation of Weltanschauung, and it's a 19th century phrase. It does not antedate that. So the worldview that we speak of is a new concept, and I always want to investigate new concepts and question what they mean and what they don't mean. And it arises with the philosophy of Hegel, and Hegel is in many ways the most important thinker for modern progressive thought. So we'll talk about Weltanschauung, worldview, but also Christian worldview. And the word Christian there is the adjective that modifies the worldview. But the idea of a worldview, in accordance with Hegel, is actually predicated on certain ideas that are at odds with Christianity. To say at odds with it, the perspective taken on it is very different. Because again, the Hegelian sense of progress, and this is not irrelevant to the conversation here, because you're going to get into notions of historiography and perspective and what we mean by reason. All of those things are going to be in discussion today. Christians, by and large, begin their discussions of the arts, the sciences, from the perspective of the 19th century onwards. In other words, they assume a Hegelian worldview, and they just want to color it with Christianity. But it begs the question of how Christian the whole concept of worldview is. And this isn't a proof or anything like that. I just simply note the concept first emerges in the 19th century. That is indisputable. And it emerges in the mouths of those who are trying to replace Christianity with a rational, progressive view of life from the perspective of man. And it will then ask the question, what do we think of God? What do we think of God? Where's the perspective of Scripture is what does God think of us? It's a completely inverted thing. So to have a worldview is, again, it seems broad, it seems to include God within it, but actually the perspective is entirely wrong. It looks down at us from our point of view. We look up towards God, and how real do we think he is? What are the basis? What are the proofs we have for God's existence, etc.? But again, from our vantage point. And so this idea of the discarded image that Lewis introduces here, I found quite helpful what he observed very early on, which is that the medievals, the Christians that employed this image in their minds did not do with the scientific rigor, or they did not hold it to as a matter of certitude to be defended at all costs. They saw it as a provisional model. And that was useful, but it could be amended as they saw fit, and things could be discarded and you could add on to it. But it's a work in progress, if you will. It's a working model. It's an artistic representation of what the authorities have taught us about everything around us. So it is a model. It's an image in that sense. And Lewis says we've discarded that image. But what have we replaced it with? Well, I'm going to submit we replace it with, and he doesn't say this himself. Lewis doesn't say it. I'm saying it. We replace it with worldview, a Hegelian worldview from the perspective of humanity. If I don't get to it at the end of the class, I'm going to push into it today, because when he comes to talk about the 7 liberal arts, he'll talk about grammar and dialectic or logic and rhetoric, the 3 arts of the trivium, and he'll talk about the 4 components of the quadrivium being mathematics or arithmetic rather, geometry, which is number extended in space, music, which is number extended in time, and astronomy extended in time. So the arts, the 7 liberal arts, are the ways of knowing then through words in the form of the trivium and through numbers in the form of the quadrivium. And to this day, even in our curriculum, we think that reading and mathematics are essential part of the j.r.r, reading, writing, arithmetic, right? So, but the centrality of words and numbers to a true education, it's true, it hasn't changed in that sense, although we don't see music as one of the sciences, even though music is associated with numbers, and strongly so. It's a highly rational field. We associate it more with feelings. That's the Romantic movement, actually. You can trace a change in the way music develops come that period. And again, it's concurrent with the 19th century and the Romantic poets. But the point here is that Lewis, when he suggests that the other image has been discarded, draws our attention to the fact that we have replaced it with another image that we're not aware is an image. We don't hold to it as a representation of reality that could be amended. We hold to it. We hold to our theory as if it were factual. We have a very, very different view of a theory. We take theory as if theory were science. And then we run into great problems when science contradicts it, or when scientists contradict themselves on new theories to explain certain things. Like when Newton gets replaced by Einstein. That creates huge challenges. And what was formerly held to be absolute certainty, this is what explains it. These are the laws. Well, the laws have just been broken. Oh, well, then how do we explain Newton and the law of gravity then? And why do we speak of it as a law? He's going to get to all that as well. This phrase, laws in relation to nature, which he notes as well, and this is very interesting. I think he must have greatly delighted in this observation. The word laws is more anthropocentric than the medieval conceptions. Things incline towards it, or they're antipathetic to it. That's love language. They're inclined towards it. They are attracted to it, as we would say. Whereas we use laws, which suggests a lawgiver, and a lawgiver that underlies the whole universe. Well, that clearly has anthropocentric connotations to our minds immediately. Anyway, so when he gives us the parts of the universe, he's now going to deal with the realm of cosmology in the sense of astronomy. But the whole of what we've been talking about is cosmology, because it will include astronomy among the other liberal arts. He's going to talk about humanity and so forth. By the way, come Hegel and the worldview of his day, there are new sciences appear called the human sciences. Psychology, sociology, anthropology. Those are brand new, not discussed in the ancient world at all, because again, they're from the perspective of mankind, from our perspective. We're going to use the methodology of the empirical sciences to verify these things, but effectively we're doing it from the perspective of man. The question is, what is man? Well, that's a question they never actually ask and can't answer. So in the realm of psychology, for example, they will say that the psyche is, variously speaking, the mind, the soul, the feelings, or maybe even the brain. Like what, and there are 60, 70 different schools of psychology recognized by the American Psychology Association, and they have a radically different view of what the psyche is, even though they call themselves sciences. I mean, totally contradictory, in fact. So how can that situation hold? Well, because our worldview depends on the man-centered perspective governing all other thoughts. And so we don't want to jettison it, even with contradictions. At the same time, we speak of it as science that can't be questioned. I just note the huge irony. So that image has been discarded. This image we hold to very strongly and won't let it go, even when the contradictions, even on definitional things, are evident and absurd. But I'm not going to do what Lewis doesn't do and defend the discarded image as correct. He says it was provisional, and there's beauty to it, and it explains the literature, and there's a coherence to it. And he's just simply saying this is the basis of medieval and Renaissance literature, and it comes from the classical world. So there's a continuity between the classical world of the pagans, whether they're Greek or Roman or Norse, and the medieval period. There's a strong overlap there in the Tao and in their view of the heavens, etc., although there are differences between the North, as I say, the Norse and the Greco-Roman world, etc. But a strong continuity there that we have now breached. And we are, Lewis says, as Christians, we are closer in our, he doesn't use the word, our worldview than to the pagans than we are to our contemporaries. That's what I began the course with. And therefore, in his own literature, that is his fiction, he will regularly appeal to aspects of this discarded image that he lays out here. And so it's essential, I think, when you're reading Lewis's fiction, to say, where did he get this fanciful idea that there are elves? Where does he, in The Silver Chair, he refers to giants on Etten Moor. Well, Etten is a medieval word for a type of giant. And he gets the whole passage from probably Homer's Odyssey, where it speaks of going to the land of the Laestrygonians, and these are giants that eat. They're carnivores. A lot of it's plucked from his reading of classical medieval literature. He just takes things, borrows, steals, whatever, without acknowledging his sources. He doesn't feel any need to do that. So if you notice that he's done that, well, good for you. Then he's happy that you've noticed it. You should notice it. That means you've read something. But Lewis does not originate the ideas. They don't come from his imagination, as in he made it all up. They're original to him as first-time thoughts. Nobody has thought of that. That's not how medievalists or classicists think. They think, I want to appeal to the authorities' conceptions of these things. And I'm going to lean on those and tell the same sort of stories again, which you will note when in first year we trace the epic from Homer's Odyssey through the Aeneid, through Dante, and then on through Milton and onwards. We can see that there's a tradition of authors reading previous authors and using their imageries, even their phrases, get repeated. but they're conventions, like invocation of the muse, council of the gods, descent to the underworld, a hero, epic types of language, etc. But even just little phrases, like the men falling like leaves, the dead are like leaves in the underworld, etc., repeatedly alluded to, just the whole phrase. And it's an homage to the foregoing authors, but he expects us to pick up the homage and to read the present writer in the light of the past, and therefore to some degree say that the image is not discarded. The image holds on. So this is what I believe in the realm of English literature. If you want to be a good writer, read good writers and use their imagery. Don't discard the image. Lewis and Tolkien don't. I'll show that next semester when we come to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. A lot of the things that Lewis is talking about here, Tolkien would entirely concur, and he will depend on the very things that Lewis presents here as foundational to medieval and Renaissance literature. But he's writing it in 20th century fiction, so is Lewis. So the thing about that I'll additionally say is, not only did they use concepts, beings, cosmologies, everything from the discarded image, it will then be commentary on their world. So it's social commentary, it's political commentary, and it's spiritual commentary on a world that has discarded that image and now has its own image, which it regards as science and unquestionable truth. Sorry.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, why do you think it works to continually recycle the same stories over and retell them, but in a different way? And why do we retell them in a different way, if not just go back to the original?
Well, so two questions. Why does it work, and why do they change it? Why does it work is a good question. Does it represent the reality that's truly there? And I think that must be a part of the question, or part of the answer, rather. So when Homer writes about the gods, the fact that there are many gods, people immediately after Homer, those that revered Homer, thought that he was wrong about the gods. That's what Plato thought was nonsense. So did Socrates. He even speaks of the god. And Aristotle talks about the unmoved mover of all things. Well, that's not the gods. They're running into some. They don't get into the mythology, and they don't get in even into the theology. They're questioning that, but they still think that Homer is of some use, and he's of use in teaching, training in wisdom and virtue, in the characters there. That they think that Homer really deals with justice rather well. He just portrays the gods as unjust, which they object to. How can we hold to justice as a permanent feature of the whole cosmos when the gods themselves are so unjust in the way they conduct themselves, even towards one another, but certainly towards human beings? It's just a power move. The difference between us and them is that they are immortal and they have greater powers, but that doesn't make them more just. It makes them less just. And as I say, even the Socratic tradition and those that follow say this can't be right. So the critique of polytheism begins among the Greeks. So that's going to move just simply for that, but they still think there's value in it. Well, in accordance with their objections to the contradictions in the Homeric portrait of the gods, the underworld, whatever, there's amendments are going to be made to what constitutes wisdom and virtue. That's going to change. So, for instance, Odysseus is a shyster. He lies all the time, and Athena praises him for it. I love you because every time you speak, you're tricking people. You're just like me, the goddess of wisdom. Okay, so wisdom is deceiving other people to get what you want. Is Homer going to be, or is Socrates going to be happy with this? No. It says we should tell the truth, and the person that lies harms his own soul. That's a pretty serious critique of the wisdom presented in Homer. And in accordance with that, people who follow the logic of Socrates there, which is pretty hard to avoid, I think, are going to say, well, then the epic has to change. And the hero is going to be a little less colorful than Odysseus. He'll be like Aeneas. a little bit boring. Aeneas isn't very colorful, but he's dutiful. Okay, so there it changes. All right, well then come Christian theology, we have a different view not only of God, but of what a human being ought to look like, because God becomes man, and this man lived a perfect human life. What does that look like? Well, it's going to look like servant leadership. Okay, well, is that not going to change the virtues of the ancient world? It absolutely flips them on their head. Washing your disciples' feet, going to the cross for their sins, not yours, not committing any sins. That's a totally transformative instance in human history. We mark it with the AD. So that's going to change the epic. So why is it valid to begin with? Because I think there's something true in it, but it's less true than the later epics become. So I think Paradise Lost is more truthful. And it's necessary that it becomes so. And I teach it not as a development of worldview, but as of epics dealing with fundamental realities. I'm not even sure I like the word worldview. I questioned it decades ago, and now I'm even less certain of it. I know what people mean by it. It's everything, all of life included in it. But note that it is an artistic representation. And so it's provisional. You don't have to hold to every tenet of that worldview. You can critique it. And how do you critique it? In accordance with faith and reason. That's the historic way we discuss these things. Faith and reason. Those in that worldview camp don't like the word reason. They're hostile. How come? Because from the worldview perspective, it seems like detached rationalism. Like the self, cogitating self, I guess the Cartesian rationalism, the cogito. Well, but that's not the reason that we meet in the Middle Ages. We'll come to that as well. He talks about intellectus and ratio. But then he'll note, come Kant, we invert the two and we put reason as the highest faculty and intellect or understanding below it. Whereas in the medieval period, it's the other way around. Reason is a subordinate faculty to the intellect. The intellect's what we share with the angels. And it's so that to use the language of the Neo-Calvinists, which I do here, the presuppositions we share with all sentient or all intellectual life. It's not just reason. We can reason to all sorts of absurd conclusions, but we can't. The realm of the intellect never changes. Reason can change things, and it should conform to the intellect, but that's a different matter. Yes?
One of the interesting things, too, about how they take what's been done before and they just change it slightly. It shows this almost conversation between intellectuals who haven't even lived in the same time period, but because you can tell they're within the same conversation.
They're in the same conversation. They're using the same terminology, and so the challenge of being a Christian intellectual is having to learn words used differently than the way they're used today. So it's partly that. Concepts, words. Well, when they use the word reason, do they mean what we mean by reason? In some sense, clearly yes, but in another sense, no, it's different. It's not Kant's pure reason. They would never pure reason? What does that mean? And what comes with the Kantian pure reason and the worldview perspective is the perspective of the orphan that I regularly have mentioned in my classes. That's the worldview. Worldview from the perspective of an orphan. Out of the context of history, tradition, family, faith, those are added on as an adjective. It's a Christian worldview. Maybe the problem is the concept of worldview altogether. Even though we want to acknowledge the goodness of what they're trying to do, they've got a bigger picture of it then. We're going to integrate our faith with the whole, all of life, etc. So anyway, that was a very long introduction, but I wanted to get to what would come at the conclusion of that when he speaks in his epilogue, which I think is very important. And he talks about Darwinism and evolutionism and an evolutionary model whereby things get better and better. and we are at the top of a staircase, the bottom of which we can't see anymore because it's in the murky darkness of the past. We don't even, and the question is, why should we even bother to look at the foot of the staircase when we're going onwards and upwards anyway? And so the most important thing from the perspective of worldview is the world around us right now, because that is the world. And we want to engage with that world. But from the perspective of Lewis and the ancients and the medievals and the Renaissance, it's actually the past where people were superior. And learning is recovering that knowledge and engaging with it, being in conversation, as you said, with those people, because they are our contemporaries insofar as truth is ever alive. And so you read Lewis, and he is now your companion for life. You can go back to him, and you may find him a better conversation partner than the people that are on the TTC with you as you ride around. In fact, I'm sure you will. Or in your churches, perhaps. People need to read more. But yes, and that's why he says, and the other thing he says about old books is when they are clearly in error, it's so clear to us that there's no danger that we're going to fall into the same error. But sometimes they say things that are so striking that we think, if I had not read this here, I would never have thought that thought, because my contemporaries never think that they're very clear tramlines in which conversations take place. But how about introduce this topic to the conversation, like cosmology or like metaphysics? Does anyone talk about those things now? Not at all, even though we had worldview. Yes?
It's rather indicative of a current philosophy that we can only think in reality, which is only well-being of God.
It's perspectivalism as big as we can imagine it. And also, they're not even taking it from their perspective. They're taking it from as an inherited, here's what our forebears said about it. Here's what Scripture says about it, because Lewis doesn't get into that too much here. He's talking more about the tradition of those who appropriated Christianity, but doesn't really get into the Christian sources for the discarded image. He occasionally comments that clear Christian influence here and not, but he doesn't get into the biblical foundation for this. But it is embedded in there for sure. But it's more that, from the perspective of worldview, well, my worldview could be broader, I hope it is, and I'm in my 50s, than people I'm teaching. But it's still not nearly as broad as the entirety of the human race who've thought about these things. My forebears, theirs is much broader. And the perspective of God on these things is broader than any human being has ever had, because it's from his perspective, not from the perspective of mankind. It's my criticism of biblical studies is they come from the perspective of the historical critical method, which is worldview. There's a certain assumptions being made there, which are, I think, bear scrutiny. Right? It's a text. Well, what do we know about the people that wrote that text? So we'll look at ancient Hittite, and we'll look at ancient Near Eastern studies, and we'll note myths and similarities, and we'll look at it from our perspective into the past as much as we can. We'll try and recover that past, but that's all we can know about it. That's the end of the conversation. Note that it's not taken as a pneumatic text that God has breathed to inform us of his ways. It's just not even considered. Impossible. That's not in conformity with the historical critical method. Note that the concept of history, again, is inherently progressivist in the historical critical method. As soon as you say critical sounds great, historical, we're going to consider those two things. Nobody before had ever considered history or was ever critical, but now we are. Anyway, I'm trying not to mock too sharply here. But let's go to the heavens, because I've given a rather extensive intro here, and I'm not getting to the heavens, and that would be terrible after 2 classes. So this is the portrait of the heavens, and what you see here is the Earth at the center of this. There is, if we could color it, we would see that we could say that the Earth is green and the seas are blue, and then the air, which is above them, and then the fire, which is outside of them, and then the moon, and then beyond the moon is this thing called ether, which lies beyond the air. But we have the four elements, earth, air, fire, water, and then ether, the fifth element, which is the element in which the planets here are bathed in ether. That's where the gods are in ether. Now we've created ether, I think, as a gas. That's not that. It's not that stuff. And then outside of all this, and you can see that they have fused a mere planetary astronomical portrait here with a Christian, because at the outside of this is the caelum imperium habitaculum Dei et omnium electorum, the kingdom of heaven, or the empire of heaven, the habitation of God and all the elect. It's on the outside of this. That's how it looks on the page. That's not what Lewis is going to say. It's not outside at all. That's one of his extraordinary observations about the medieval worldview, is we tend to see it from the perspective of worldview as if we're at the center. And therefore, that's outside, but that's not how the medievals see it. They don't look at it the way we look at the solar system, which is to look into outer space. They don't see it that way. Because what's outer space is space, it's empty space. There's nothing there. You look up and there's nothing. It's emptiness. He observes that is an observation of Blaise Pascal in the 17th century. Milton speaks of space in his epic. He also speaks of other conceptions. I'll hopefully come to that. But that immediate assumption that heaven is outside of everything, no medievalist would ever hold. So the little picture here is deceptive, and we interpret it wrongly immediately. That's not what they would have concluded from this very picture. So that's interesting itself, that we immediately impose our worldview perspective into a astronomical model. Because what they see when they look to give it away, when they see at the outside here, they think that what's outside is actually inside. The most solid, real, substantial place where things never change, where they are permanent, where things are eternal, outside space and time, is where God is. And we are on a little subdivision, a suburb of the city of God. Remember, Augustine calls this the city of God, where God resides. Oh, there's a good point. I wanted to put this up here as well. This is what I do to myself. Dante, Duomo, Florence. Let me give him an image here. There you go. What a good one. Is that okay? Oh my goodness. Open image in new tab. Is that going to do it? There we go. I have no idea what alamy means. This is on the inside of the Duomo, the Florence, this place, the cathedral in Florence, famous cathedral in Florence. On the inside of that is this fresco. And this man is Dante, acquainting us with the three places that he describes in the Commedia. Hell, the Inferno, Purgatorio, and here Paradiso. Now notice Paradiso looks like Florence. So is he saying, is he such a worldly being that he thinks that Florence is heaven? Is that what he means by it? Because it looks like it. No, he has in mind that the cities of this world should mirror and emulate the city of God. And the city of God is, note the spheres up above him, or up and above. They're the two cities. You need to read Augustine's City of God in this. So back to this picture, the kingdom of heaven, or the empire of heaven, is presented as a great city, and we are outside of that city. Nowhere near it. So far from being the center of things, God is the center of things, even though on the map it looks like the earth is at the center of things. But no medievalist would ever think that we're at the center of things, let alone that human life is that important, that everything revolves around us, as this suggests. And we deride them for that. Absurd. Oh, they're so think that everything revolves around humanity. We're the ones who thinks everything revolves around humanity. That's why we interpret it the way we do. Yes?
So the medieval saw cities as a good thing and reflective of...
No, they saw cities as good and evil. There are good cities and evil cities. But the city of God is good, and it says in the book of Hebrews that Abraham sought a city whose architect and builder was God. The reason he left his land of Ur, of the Chaldees, was he sought a city. But the first city was built by Cain. And Jerusalem, the city of God, persecuted the prophets always and killed them, and it included Christ. So there's an ambiguous relation to the cities, and again, that's part of Augustine's city of God. Cities are not where God is more present, and in fact, in many ways, they're where God is more absent and more hostile. The cities of this world represent in some place the Tower of Babel, which actually arises in the land of Ur, where Daniel and his friends are schlepped when they go into exile. They go to the land of Ur. They don't go to Babylon. It doesn't say Babylon. They go to the land of the Chaldees. Now, that happens to be where Babylon is. That's the center of the Babylonian Empire, and the king of that day is Nebuchadnezzar, who's a sort of satanic figure, building a great bronze statue of himself. Happens to have clay feet, but so there's something being common about the city of Babylon, Babylon the Great, that's doing what? Well, look at the book of Revelation. Again, there's a relation between the two cities. Well, here we have the Babylonians who've captured the people of Israel because they were rebellious, and yet the city of God is in the presence even of the Babylonians, and Daniel speaks God's truth even in the midst of that horrible situation of punishment and exile. So extraordinary thoughts. And so, yeah, the relation of cities to the city of God is a very complicated one. But, right, God is in the midst of those cities. And so Augustine, writing City of God, is defending Christians on the destruction of Rome by the barbarians. They've come in and sacked the city, and the Christians are being accused of having corrupted Roman morality, and that's why the Romans have failed. It's because the Christians took over. And he says, not so. And even in the midst of a ruin, the city of God still stands. There are two cities, and the one is in the midst of the other. And so I think that that's exactly what Dante has in mind here, or at least the painter who paints Dante here, he has in mind with the city of Florence is that is a model of the city which is outside the spheres, which we see there above him, and so forth. And note that the Purgatorio moves up towards this is the earthly paradise at the top of that. It's getting closer to God. Lots of representation going on there. You have to interpret the painting. It's not self-evident what it's showing. But I've already digressed a fair bit here. But I've given you some of the stuff that he's going to say, which I think is truly revolutionary there, which is that when the medieval mind, and I'll read the exact passage here because his presentation of it is too good. Where is it? 98, I think, is what I have in my book. Is that right? It's not. I thought I had this written down for sure. Yeah, okay, well, I'll read from 98. Follow my own notes, even though I'm doubting my own notes. He says on 98 that the medieval model is vertiginous. Oh, it's not all the way there, that's for sure. The medieval model is vertiginous. And the fact that the height of the stars in the medieval astronomy is very small compared with their distance in the modern will turn out not to have the kind of importance you anticipated. For thought and imagination, 10 million miles and 1,000 million are much the same. It doesn't really, it's just a rounding. But it's still an extraordinary distance, and they know the stars are an extraordinary distance above us. They might get the assessment of actually how far wrong by a couple of zeros, doesn't matter. It's so far beyond, like a voyage in life could never go that far. That's how far away they are. Both can be conceived, that is, we can do sums with both, and neither can be imagined. That's the point. It's an unimaginable distance. And the more imagination we have, the better we shall know this. Problem with many of our contemporaries who critique the medieval worldview is they have zero imagination. Absolutely none. So they can't, and again, they don't think the imagination is relevant when we're talking about worldview, though it is. It's entirely relevant. You need your imagination to be able to think properly, because you have to conceive multiple things in the picture that you see. The really important difference is that the medieval universe, while unimaginably large, was also unambiguously finite. That's interesting. It was unambiguously finite. It didn't have eternity about it, whereas we think the solar system extends infinitely. They'll talk about the infinite spaces even. They'll use the word infinite. There's no finitude to it. This is a medieval model, and it is like a little bauble. It's like a thing on a chain, a pendant on a chain. In fact, the word cosmos in Greek does mean what we associate with cosmology, but the Greek word cosmos suggests like a bauble, like on a Christmas tree, an ornament from which we get the word cosmetics. You're making up your face with cosmetics. You're making your face look like the heavens. Shining, color, how beautiful the cosmos, how beautiful your face. You got cosmetics on. So the medievals, when they looked up, they saw beauty, but also a finite representation of reality to which the infinite and eternal places of God are a pale shadow in comparison. How much greater God is than the beauty of the universe. That's how great. So they understand that it's just a model and it's finite. We don't think that way. We think it's infinite, eternal, vast, and empty. And I think that has theological implications as well in terms of people's passions and imaginations. They can't imagine that God could care, because God is absent. Deus absconditus.
Really
not hidden.
The modern day looks out and just sees it as empty. Because I feel like often,
Because of science fiction?
like not just science fiction though too, but like just like people, I just notice people who have an interest in space.
Like the Hubble telescope, and they can show you the different
They see so
fantastic
much, and
pictures.
as to what's out there, right?
Yeah.
There is so much beauty out there, and they find it so cool being mesmerized by the grandness of it. So
Yeah.
I feel like that isn't completely lost.
No, it's especially when they can do what they do now, when they couldn't do in Lewis's day, which is take pictures from the Hubble telescope, and just extraordinary beauty in the constellations that invisible to the naked eye, especially from the perspective of the light pollution of, you're taking those. The perspective of the Hubble telescope is from outside of the air, which sort of prevents you from seeing it as clearly as you might. So I think you're correct, but when Lewis is writing this, the concept of what is out there is literally out. We call it outer space. That is actually an implication of a worldview to call it outer space. And it's opposite, or it's already discarded the image that this presents, which is not, there's no space in this worldview. Everything's populated. Remember, we said that above the moon is the realm of the daemons, the demons, or the intelligences, what Lewis calls the archons, who live on Mercury and Venus and the Sun and Mars and Jupiter, etc. There are intelligences in each of those spheres. So it's populated. It's more, and what's up at the top or on the outside influences everything that comes down below. So it influences human history. What happens in the constellation of the heavens, and that's understood even by the Babylonians, which is why when they see the constellation of the planets and the stars align in a certain way, they say that event which we read in scriptures is going to happen, is about to happen, so let's go. They arrived 6 months late, by the way. The wise men from the east, they show up 6 months late. But still, they knew it was coming on the basis of their understanding of astronomy. And so there is a connection between astronomy and the events of this world, which astrology talks about. I'll get to astrology if I don't keep talking and run out of time. But the word small is applied to the earth, thus takes on a far more absolute significance. Again, because the medieval universe is finite, it has a shape. Our universe is shapeless. It's void. It's empty. It might have color in it, but that's not a shape. They talk about distance and time and space-time, and that's how the physicists talk about that. And there was the Big Bang, and then everything rushed out, so you can see it and notice it, but there's no shape to it. Whereas theirs has a decided shape, and you don't get that from that picture behind me. You don't get a sense of shape, but for them, that's shape. So Lewis is acquainting us with this. So it has a perfectly spherical shape containing within itself an ordered variety. Hence, and here's the passage, to look out on the night sky with modern eyes is like looking out over a sea, or let's look, we got Lake Ontario, look out over Lake Ontario, that fades away into mist, or looking about one in a trackless forest, trees forever and no horizon. Or go to Saskatchewan and you look and it's just flat. The sky, everything seems bigger. It's just that's the sublime experience. But that's what we see when we look out. It's just vastness, space without limit. They never see that. Doesn't occur to them. Never imagine it. To look up at the towering medieval universe is much more like looking at a great building. Go to the CN Tower, stand at the base and look up. It's that sort of a sense. Oh, look at how big that is. They see big. We see vast. Not the same thing at all. So the space, he puts in scare quotes, of modern astronomy may arouse terror or bewilderment or vague reverie. The spheres of the old present us with an object in which the mind can rest, overwhelming in its greatness but satisfying in its harmony. That is the sense in which our universe is romantic and theirs was classical. So there he presents it in terms of classical and romantic, and ours is romantic. He's correct, because the romantics will also assume this, and in the fiction of the romantics, they will appeal to outer space, like Byron does in Cain, a work by Lord Byron called Cain. He presents space and time and the horror that arises with this. And so I'll just read a little bit more and then I'll move forward. This explains why all sense of the pathless, the baffling, and the utterly alien, all agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is the fear of the marketplace, of the empty space. Some people are terrified of going out in public because they feel insecure. There's nothing around them. I think there's probably something like that on social media as well. Because you look at yourself and you see an image of yourself, but that's not you. You know it's not you. Is there a world that, it's like the Matrix. Is there anything outside? It's a terrifying thought. You see yourself as a disembodied entity on the screen in front of you. Is that me? It's not just, I have a pimple on my face and I don't like the look of that. It's just like, is that really how other people see me? And is that all that I am? And there's you're reflecting on yourself in a very odd way. Just like a mirror, but, and I think agoraphobia is associated with that same sense of my body having no real reality to it. And there's a terror that comes from that sense of alienation from your own body, your own sense of self. But he says Dante, whose theme might have been expected to invite it, never strikes that note. The meanest modern writer of science fiction can, in that department, do more for you than he. Blaise Pascal's terror at le silence éternel de ces espaces infinis never entered his mind. The eternal silence of the infinite spaces terrifies me, says Pascal. Never occurs to anyone before him. and the experience of terror in the face of the sky. Because when they look at the sky, there's something there. It's full. It's not empty, it's full. And that immediately changes your perspective on anything. There's much less terror when you're surrounded by good things as well as bad things, but mostly good things because it's a created order. God has created the order. That's good. No randomness in this. No randomness. Preordained. Personal involvement. God's created it. He is the creator. He remains the creator. He holds everything together. He's there. That sense of presence is there. In the modern worldview, he's absent, which will lead Francis Schaeffer to speak about. It's not absent and so forth. We're speaking to, again, a worldview that denies the presence of anything. He says that Giordano Bruno is probably the originator of this sense of emptiness. And it says it comes into English poetry through Milton. But as far as the operations of these planets, let's get to this very briefly. The operations of these planets, I'll skip over that. He does say that astrology is not specific. Let me say something about the astrology, because we associate astrology with the medievals and thereby with a sort of a fatalism and paganism and so forth. He says astrology, first of all, it's not specifically medieval. They inherit it from antiquity and they bequeath it to the Renaissance. And it's still in Elizabethan courts, they're doing astrology. And the statement that the medieval church frowned upon this discipline is often taken in a sense that makes it untrue. Why? Because Orthodox theologians could accept the theory that the planets had an effect on events and on psychology and so on and so on. In fact, they regularly appeal to it. Depends on when you were born, under what, right? So, and also they can observe what we observe, that, here's the picture again. The moon in its proximity or in its cycle, at a full moon, there's an influence, a clear manifest influence on the earth. The tides rise. And things go mad. They act in a crazy way. Hence we say that they speak of lunacy, influence of the moon. It's the influence of the moon. They can observe that. That's the closest planet, or of the constellations, and we can observe that influence. How much more the other ones who are greater and influence the others, because at the outside of all this is the primum mobile, the prime mover, and it moves in, they move in circles, go opposite to one another. So one goes, let's say, clockwise, the one inside of it anti-clockwise, and vice versa. And when they move in different directions, they oscillate and they make a music, a celestial music, the music of the spheres, which you hear about in English hymnody, which we cannot hear nonetheless. And then there's a theory of music, which Boethius will present in his De Musica, that there are 3 different types of music. I'll not get into that here. If you do Milton with me next semester, I will present it then. But roughly speaking, there is the celestial music, which we cannot hear. There is the instrumental music, which we can hear and corresponds exactly in terms of mathematical precision to that music of the celestial spheres. And then there's a musica humana within the human breast that corresponds to harmony and order. This is why music affects us, because music acquaints us with harmony and order and beauty. We can hear it, and that what we hear is beautiful, but how much more beautiful are the voices of the angels that we can't hear, that sing praises to God. So we're tuning our voices for a song that we will one day sing and weep with delight, which we never think about if we think heaven's going to be like a praise service and I hear the person sing next to me and they cannot sing one note rightly. Like, this would be terrible. This forever and eternally. Really? No, because music is an eternal thing and we're imitating it as best we can. And if we're pitch perfect, it can sound really stunning, but nothing to compare to this. Anyway, so the planets have that, and note that the 7 planets here, the 8, the firmament here, will then correspond to the musical scale. So music will correspond exactly to astronomy. And it's numerically connected and so forth. So again, I talked about the quadrivium, music and arithmetic and astronomy will be connected also with geometry. So everything that is true of all of those things will be true of one, will be true of the others. So now you can see why even when they're talking about astronomy, it's a very practical earthly thing. They can hear it in their music. You can sense it in just geography. There's an order that is intrinsic to all of the things that we can see and measure and quantify, and a beauty, furthermore, which we can sense in music. Everyone senses beauty in music. But the beauty of the music is the same beauty that lies behind the arithmetic and behind the astronomy, and is true of the created order, the world in which we live, that we can measure. And so therefore, buildings ought to look like Dante's Duomo. And medievalists therefore create beautiful buildings that are meant to last the test of time. They're meant to last for thousands of years. They sometimes take hundreds of years to build, and they're supposed to last forever. And inside them, they will have beautiful things like this portrait, but often they will present other things. They're meant to last. Modern architecture is not meant to do any such thing. It's there to serve a functional purpose. And then you rip it down when it becomes a little bit old. Tear down that house and build a new one. Or tear down that football stadium and build a new state-of-the-art facility. There's nothing more state-of-the-art than the Duomo in Florence. But it's a different image. Okay, so the operations of these. Well, the primum mobile 102, I'll just read mine, revolves from east to west, completing its circle every 24 hours. That's pretty quick. Like this on the outside, the primum mobile, that goes from here to here, east to west in 24 hours. That's why the influence is so strong. The speed at which it must move, and then move the others that move less quickly underneath it, creates what he calls a kindly inclining, a far slower revolution from west to east, which takes 36,000 years to complete. But the daily impulse of the primum mobile forces them daily back, as with its wash or current, so that their actual movement is westward, but at a speed retarded by their struggle to move in the opposite direction. So, and the friction creates the oscillation, which creates that music that we can't hear. Besides movement, the spheres transmit to the earth what are called influences. The subject matter of astrology not specifically medieval, and he says that the church is willing to accept that the constellations can influence what happens on earth, but they do fight back against 3 things. 1, predictions, sorcery on the basis of these, and you know, the palm reading, the sort of the. Secondly, determinism. Just because this constellation happens does not mean, like Oedipus, that you're fated for this to happen. You do not have to marry your mother and murder your father. The idea of fatalism, that's a pagan view, but that has nothing to do with Christianity, because God creates outside of space and time, and he gives us the freedom to respond to him. We have a freedom of agency, secondary causes. We have that capacity. We are not deterministic beings. We're not determined by our past. We're not determined by what today is the return of fatalism, which is genetics. Right? Your life is going to be terrible because look at your genetic inheritance. You better abort that baby. We want to stop that in its tracks before it begins. They're totally opposed to determinism. And then finally, anything that involves or suggests the worship of planets, forbidden by the church. Even though they will suggest that there are intelligences on those planets or somewhere in them, you must not worship the planets. You can see that in the ancient world as well, forbidden in scripture. The sun and the moons and the seasons and all that, can't do that. But astrology, the idea that the constellations in some ways have an influence on the earth, yes, you can consider that, because they do have an influence, because everything influences everything else, and particularly the things up there influence what happens down here. That's what's up there is where the really important things happen. Down here, not so much. So the specifics of this, oh my goodness. So I am not going to read them, but what I will do is direct your attention to this, that he will go on through the different planets here. There are 7 planets. Saturn, this is page 105 if you want, and Jupiter, also 105, Mars, 106. Sol, let me say something about Sol. Sol is the sun. And note that the sun is represented here in terms of alchemy by a dot in the middle of a circle. And that is the symbol for gold in alchemy, the dot in the middle of the circle. John Donne will use this in a valediction forbidding mourning to describe the pair of compasses revolving around the lover going out. And if you, it's a valediction forbidding mourning. If you don't weep, I will be like the fixed foot in the center, and I will, when I come home, it'll be a perfect circle. Symbol of perfection, it's like gold. And he uses like gold to airy thinness, beat, etc. He says that mythically, Jupiter's the king after he usurps his father Saturn. But Sol produces the noblest metal, gold, and is the eye and the mind of the whole universe. The sun is. So even though the sun is just one of the constellations here, it's the most important one intellectually. So interesting to see how they do that. They're not heliocentric, they're geocentric in their cosmology. You can see that the earth is at the center of it. But the sun operates in the sense of the realm of the theologians and philosophers in the same way it does for us. Though he is no more metallurgical than any other planet, his metallurgical operations are more often mentioned than others. And then he'll give various illustrations. And then he'll go on through Venus on 107, and the moon, which I'll now spend a few seconds on as well, on page 108. Because at the moon we cross, or Luna, we cross in our descent, the great frontier which I have so often had to mention, from ether to air. From heaven, which is above the moon, to nature, which is below the moon. Remember, nature is just that realm. It does not include everything. It just includes that realm. And he says, and that's from the realm of the gods or the angels to that of the daemons. So beneath the moon, the demons reside, or daemons. And he says, from the realm of necessity to that of contingents. So of change, mutability, possibility. Up there, things are necessary and they cannot change. That's fatalistic. But guess what? The fatalistic, deterministic character of the planets above the moon is not characteristic of those that fall beneath the moon, which is why we can see things change, including human life. This is why people die. Everything below the moon is prone to change. Not so the stars, not so the planets above, and certainly not God, who's outside space and time, in addition to all of those other characteristics here. So the word sublunary is rather different. It's under the moon as a symptom of, or as a symbol of all sorts of different connotations. And the metal for the moon is silver, hence the silver chair. So you can read, and I'll come to that when we look at the Narnia Chronicles. I'll look at one critic's observation of the influence of particular planets on the works contained there. But the silver chair is under the influence of the moon, which is why it begins with lunacy as well. There's a madman, and he has to go under the earth and all that. We'll get into that. But see, once you start picking up these little different senses, suddenly Lewis's fiction starts to, that's why silver chair, that's why the moon, that's why the lunacy, that all those associations, they just jump at him. He hasn't made it up. It couldn't have been a platinum chair. It had to be a silver chair. Is it roughly the same color? Yes, but it's silver as the moon and associated with lunacy. When he gets strapped in the silver chair, he loses his mind temporarily. Or does he? Actually, no, he becomes sane for that 1 hour. Anyway, and we get the word lunacy from that, etc. But I'll skip over that. And then finally, the word influence in the modern sense that is as gray an abstraction as the whole range of our language affords. We must take great care not to read this, the word's withered senility, back into its use by older poets, where it is still a fully conscious metaphor from astrology. We don't speak of influence that way anymore. That person was so influential in my life. That's not what they mean by that. Influence in the older poets means that it has a cosmic significance, and we don't even mean that by rhetorically. We don't mean the person is that influential. They weren't like the influence of Saturn and Jupiter and the planets on me. They had, some influence, but not like this. Finally, nothing is more deeply impressed on the cosmic imaginations of a modern than the idea that the heavenly bodies move in a pitch black and cold, dead vacuity. Not so in the medieval model. You've already got that, and the sense of being outside looking in is also there. So again, in the Narnia Chronicles, at the end of this, in the last battle, Aslan encourages the children to go further up, which we can, up's okay, but further in, that is like, what? Why are we going further in? This is why. Because the city, which is on the outside of the picture, is actually meant to be conceptually be seen differently. It's the real inside, and we're outsiders, even though we're in the center of the model, as we see it. So we're going in to the heavenly city, and we're currently outside of it, and it is going upwards because we're going to something greater. But we're not going out. Come on, children, further up, further out. Because of this. And then how does God move things? He moves as beloved. He moves other things, that is, as an object of desire moves those who desire it. The primum mobile is moved by its love for God, and being moved communicates motions to the rest of the universe. So when he comes to the four loves, the agape love, which characterizes God, is going to move all the other forms of love that are inferior to it. Necessarily. You can see how everything fits. Poetically, at any rate. And you need to have a poetic imagination to see this right. So, granted that the spheres are moved by love for God, a modern may still ask why this movement should take the form of rotation. To any ancient or medieval mind, I believe the answer would have been obvious. Love seeks to participate in its object, to become as like its object as it can. But finite and created beings can never fully share the motionless ubiquity of God, just as time, however it multiplies its transitory presence, can never achieve this totem stimul of eternity. The nearest approach to the divine and perfect ubiquity that the spheres can attain is the swiftest and most regular possible movement in the most perfect form, which is circular. So we give rings. This token of our love. Exchange rings, symbol of eternity, symbol of love that unites and connects and holds all things together. It's just a symbol. It's not just between husband and wife. It's a symbol of that. Each sphere attains in a less degree the sphere above it, and therefore has a slower pace, etc. So there's an intellectual love within all of that, which is necessary to the whole model. Okay, so I am now really, I did far worse than I usually do, which is saying something, because I am terrible at getting through everything because I get really excited and interested in what I'm doing and can't help but comment. Let me say a few things about the longevity he speaks about in section 6, 122. Let me not bother with that. These are the long-lived. You'll recall in good illustration is probably the Lord of the Rings is a better one. It will be more, will connect with you more. Where the long-lived reside is ambiguous, but what we learn about the long-lived in medieval Renaissance literature, even classical literature, is that they are marginal and fugitive creatures. We don't see them all around us. And because they are insignificant from a normal experiential vantage point, he says they have imaginative value. Precisely because we don't see them normally. And precisely because not much is even said about them, they take on a huge imaginative value. So the Pans and the Fauns and the Satyrs and the Sylvans and the Nymphs and even the fairies are mentioned in medieval literature, but not too much attention is paid to them. It's there. But they become, note how significant they are in Tolkien. Huge. And in Lewis's fiction, they're all over there. Like, the emphasis is so strong. It's very unmedieval to pay so much attention to such beings. Even Aragorn is a long-lived man. He's part of a race of men that lived in a way that no mortal man now lives. Nobody lives that as long as Aragorn. He looks so young. Yeah, but I knew your grandfather. What? And what he wants to do in this section is to debunk certain notions of that connected with fairies, which they're small and cute and friendly and whatever. He says that's not the portrait we get in medieval literature at all. And he uses 3 passages from Milton to illustrate the different ways in which fairies could be conceived. That's on page 123. You can look at those 3 passages. But often they are gigantic figures. Not small. They can be big. Unlike Tolkien's portrait in the film, The Lord of the Rings, they can be huge. They can even be giants. And there's a parallel between the elves and the Ettins and the giants. And Beowulf, Bergerac is an elf. He's green, yeah, but he's a gigantic figure. And there's something malign about him there. By the way, the dark view of fairies really pops up in the 16th century. Same time as witchcraft takes on an extraordinary subject of interest. And if you read Lewis's introduction to literature of the 16th century, he notes that the preoccupation with witches is a very modern one. It is not a medieval one. They're not interested in witches and burning witches and finding witches. That's King James. That's New England. It's a very short episode in the history of the world and of humanity, not characteristic of the church at all, but it was characteristic for that brief span of time. King James is so preoccupied with it that Shakespeare writes Macbeth to deal with that particular preoccupation and fear. There are 4 theories of fairies, and he's not sure which one's correct, but he just presents all of them. One is that they are a third type of rational species alongside the angels and men. Secondly, that they are angels, but they're demoted angels. Not fallen. That's the 4th. They're demoted angel. Third, that they are the dead in some guise. The fairies are actually the dead walking around us. And the 4thly is that they are actually fallen angels, in which case they are decidedly dark. But that is there in reference to the fairies that he sees there. I am going to stop there because I have definitely come to the end of this. And I'm going to come back to this briefly before reading De Descriptione Temporum, which is the next topic of discussion, but I'll eat into that a little bit with this because I want to get to its portrait of a couple of things. One, the rational soul and this division between intellect and ratio. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about its conception of history, and I want to talk about the influence of the model and his notes in the epilogue. I want to say that before we come to De Descriptione Temporum, and you'll see that it comes out of this. But it's an obvious connection. Okay, so I'll see you next class.